guys, welcome back to another new video, and today I am really excited because we are going to compare this extremely cheap watercolor cakes by Camel, which is only around 25 rupees for around 15 colors, to a more affordable one also by Camel, and this one is actually Artist's Watercolor Cake by them, and this has around 18 shades in it. This is in the price range of around 325 to 350, but I don't exactly remember the price because I bought it a long time ago, and as you can see I've used it before, and that's why all the paints are cracked and they are all projecting out of their pans. If you have been with me for a really long time, then I'm sure you would have seen that. And for the most expensive one, I'm going to be using this MUNGYO watercolor paints, which is of artist professional quality, and this comes around 1500 to 1800, and I have a separate review for that, so I'll leave it in the description box for you to check that out. Since we are testing them today, I just wanted to give them an equal playground, so I'm going to be using this brustro artist watercolor paper, and also for the brushes I'm going to be using my good quality brushes, and those are the Princeton Heritage ones, and also as the Nellier Raphael soft aqua brush. Let's start our test with the cheapest watercolors there is, and that is this one, the Camel Student's Watercolor Cake, and it comes with a tiny brush, and I think it's going to be of no use, so I'll just keep that aside. The very first thing that I do is spray some water onto the cakes, because this way the water will be soaked into those cakes and it will be easier for me to pick up the paint with my brush. I'm going to keep that aside, and I'm just going to wet the paper to test how well these paints perform when we use the wet on wet technique, that is applying wet paint over wet paper. And the very first thing that I noticed is that these paints gave up their pigments really quickly. I mean, I can really get a fully loaded brush within just a few swipes. I didn't have to rub the paints at all, it just came up really quickly. As soon as the paint touched the paper, it just exploded. All of the pigments stayed in one place, but there was kind of like an explosion all around it, like, impact circle, I don't know what that's called, but it was like that. And the paint is just simply sitting there, it's not moving at all, it's not spreading at all, it's so uneven. I mean, I don't really like it so far, I don't like it. Since this set came along with this lid, and I think it has kind of ridges in it, but I can't be sure. But anyway, I'm just going to use that as my palette, and the next test that we're going to do is the blending test. And let's see how well they blend with each other. In my opinion, I think these paints created a really good gradient, and when I blended another color to it, like this blue, I think it blended quite quickly, but at the same time I had to do a lot of work. The pigments didn't move at all, they didn't spread at all, so I had to spread them a lot to create an even nice gradient. Now let's test how well these can perform when we use the wet on dry technique, that is using wet paint on dry paper, and I'm just going to draw some leaves with it. And the very first thing that I noticed is that these paints are really quite intense. These are saturated, of course, but at the same time they're not as bright as I wanted them to be. They're quite dull paints. I mean, they're really dull in my opinion. Now comes the most important test of all, and that is the black line test. We do this because it really shows up the character of the paint, and I'm really not impressed with it because these paints are really chalky and they are really opaque. They are not transparent at all, and I don't like it so far. And now let's test this Artist's Watercolor Cakes, also by Camel, and I'm just going to spray some water to activate the paint. And just as we did before, we are going to do the same exact test for this one also, so that we can compare them easily. Let's start with a wet on wet test. And as soon as I picked up my brush to pick up the paint, the first thing that you can notice is that it doesn't release its pigments really quickly. Even though we activated these paints before by spraying water, I had to keep rubbing the cakes with my brush to get a fully loaded brush. As soon as the paint touched the paper, it did spread quite evenly, but at the same time, it didn't explode like the previous one. It's retaining its shape, but also it is spreading quite evenly. Moving on to the blending test, I first created an even gradient with the yellow color, and that was really good. I mean, it was an even gradient. And when I added another color to blend it together, the very first thing that I noticed is that they do blend together really quickly, but at the same time, the pigments didn't move around as much as I wanted them to be. I had to do a lot of work to create an even nice blending. And for the wet and dry technique, I'm going to paint leaves as before. And for the black line test, which is the most important test, I'm going to lay down the paint so close to each other so that they can blend together, just to see how well they react with the colors next to them. And now let's do the same test to these MUNGYO watercolor paints and let's see how well they perform. I'm going to repeat the exact same test that we did for the previous two paints. Starting with the wet on wet technique, the first thing that you can see is that these paints give up their pigments really quickly. I mean, I can get a fully loaded brush with just 1 or 2 swipes. As soon as the paints touched the paper, the paint spread really beautifully. I mean, they are still intact, but at the same time, they are spreading really evenly and really beautifully. And for the blending test, these paints blended together so easily and so beautifully. I couldn't see any streaks. I didn't do that much of work to get an even nice blending. The paints moved around a lot on their own. So that was easy for me to create an even nice blending between two colors. For the wet on dry technique, the leaves look a lot more intense and a lot more saturated and vibrant at the same time. They don't look dull, they are really bright. And for the black line test, I'm going to do the same thing again. I'm going to lay the paints close to each other. Here's our test results. This is the cheapest, the affordable, and the expensive one. Let's take a look at the cheapest one here. And the very first thing that you can notice is the uneven blending. Even though I tried a lot to get uneven blending, I just couldn't do that. It is still streaky when you compare it to the other two. And also in here, you can clearly see the paint didn't move as much as it should, and it is just staying in one single place. You can clearly see that. And also the paints are really chalky. I mean, there is literally dust in my hands right now. Let me just show you in just a minute. I'm just going to rub it with tissue paper, and as you can see, the paint did come off. That's how chalky that is. As for the black line, I think it's almost covered with paint because it's really chalky, it's quite opaque and not transparent. Moving on to the affordable one, the paint did spread quite evenly and the blending is quite okay, and it's not completely uneven. I mean, it's good. And for the black line, it is almost transparent, it is almost visible. There is only little bit of deposit on a few colors, and the paint didn't transfer as much as the previous one, so they are not as chalky as the previous one. Moving on to the expensive one, the colors really did spread evenly when we did the wet on wet technique. And as for the blending, I think it is the smoothest of all the three. As you can see, the transition is really smooth and it is not streaky at all when you compare it to the previous one. And as for the black line, it is completely free of deposit except the last color, that is the white. They are really transparent and there isn't any deposit on the black line whatsoever except the white, because I had to take up a lot of white paint. And there isn't much of a transfer. When I rubbed the tissue paper, the pigments didn't transfer at all. So that is a really good quality paint. And now let's put these paints to an actual test where we paint something using all of these three paints and see how well they do that. I'm just going to paint galaxy themed feathers. I think it's going to be fun, and also we are going to use all of the major techniques, that is the wet on wet and the wet on dry for this one. So it's going to be fun and interesting. Just as before, I'm going to use the cheapest one first and then move on to the expensive. And like I said before, the paints didn't blend together as easily as I wanted them to, so I was quite struggling, but at the same time, I could make it work if I do a lot of hard work. I mean, I had to push these paints around a lot to get at least to this result. And I think I actually like this painting. And moving on to the Artist's Watercolor Cakes by Camel, that is an affordable one, and I'm just going to do the same thing again. I'm just going to paint these feathers like a galaxy, and just as I said before, the paints do move and they do blend together quite easily when you compare it to the first one, but at the same time, it was quite difficult to get an even nice blending. The only major problem that I had with these pans is that they didn't release their pigments quite easily. I had to rub it a lot to get a fully loaded brush, and that's my only issue with it. And in my opinion, I think these paints are really good. They are really far better than the first one. I mean, they blend really easily, they look intense, they look saturated, so that's okay for me for now. And now let's move on to the expensive one, and that is the MUNGYO watercolor set. The first thing that you can notice straight away is that the pigments are really nice and saturated, and they are really intense. And I just got a fully loaded brush with just 1 or 2 swipes, and as you can see, the colors are rich and intense. So I really like these paints. The colors mix together so easily and quickly, and I didn't do a lot of work to get an even nice blending. And as you can see, the colors are really rich and really intense. That's it for our testing, and now the time for results. And in my opinion, I think it's going to be so hard for you if you're just a beginner, if you're just starting out in watercolor, to use this cheap set by Camel, that is a 25 rupees one. Please don't use that if you're just starting out. Buy an affordable one, that is the Camel Artist's Watercolor Cakes. That is going to perform much better when you compare it to the cheapest one. And if you want to have fun, if you want to enjoy the process of painting, then you should definitely buy the MUNGYO set, because it's going to be worth every single penny. But if you can't, if you are on a budget, then I would definitely say that you can go for the affordable one. That is going to be really helpful for you. So that is my final verdict on these paints. So I hope you liked today's video. So if you did, then do give this video a big thumbs up and let me know what you think in the comment section down below, and I'll talk to you guys in my next video. Until then, bye everybody.